Hi all, time now just to have a look at the backhand shovel push with anti-spin, again against a backspin ball. And what you'll see here is a lot of similarities between this stroke and the long pip version. And I'm settling now, just getting into the feel of the anti-spin. It just has a slightly different throw and feel to the long pips, so it just takes a little while for me to adjust my stroke and get the feel of it, and getting into it now. Okay, so as you can see, the basic stroke mechanic is really not that different. Again, the technique is similar, slightly different bat angle. The anti-spin really does throw a little bit higher than the long pips, which means I don't have to have my bat quite as open as the long pips in the feel of it. And what I'm doing here is just overcompensating a little bit, because it does tend to pop up a bit more. I'm turning my bat a little bit too much down to compensate for that, and consequently hitting the net a few times. But that's fine, that's just part of the adjustment process. And now getting into it again. So main things to watch for is, again, just look for the similarities, just a simple stroke. Again, not much wrist, using the elbow mainly as the pivot, and just really not a punching motion, but a abbreviated version of the push stroke, and a little bit up as well, and just again allowing the anti-spin to turn the backspin on the ball to topspin. One thing I do find though with this particular anti-spin that I'm using, which is the Osaka anti-power, it's a good anti-spin, very good for aggressive play. I wouldn't call it the most spin reversal anti-spin out there. I'd say something along the lines of the Shriver anti-killer. The Shriver the butterfly anti-spin would reverse a lot more spin than the Osaka anti-power. However, I never found the Shriver, the butterfly version, quite as easy to hit with. So again, it's a little bit of a trade-off, and I'm looking forward to hopefully having a go with the Dr. Nabauer anti-special sometime in the future, and give you my thoughts on that. So again, really just a similar stroke, and now just moving into a slow motion version. And you'll see here that really the only thing that's going wrong in terms of the ball going over or going into the net is mainly just the bat angle. And it's a matter of me finding the correct bat angle for this particular anti-spin. The actual stroke mechanics are quite simple, and what that means is, because the stroke itself is played in such a simple manner, it doesn't actually take me all that long to adjust, because I don't have to change my swing a great deal. I don't have to swing a lot faster, a lot slower, adjust my wrist, the amount of wrist I'm using very much. I really just have to find the correct bat angle, and then after that my stroke is pretty much dialed in, and I'm ready to go. Some people like to, when they're adjusting their bat angles, some people will tend to, if they miss it by popping up too high, they try and bring it down a little bit at a time to adjust. That can work. I usually find it just as easy that if I miss very high in training, my next stroke will be, I'll deliberately aim quite low and try and find that should then produce a ball that goes into the net. I'd look at the height of the ball that goes into the net, and based on that go somewhere in between the two extremes. And I find that sometimes allows me to adjust my angle a lot faster than slowly trying to get it lower, 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 lower. By just going too high, deliberately going very low, looking at the result going in between, you can adjust a lot quicker during training. Let's look now at the front view, again with the Yasaka anti-power. Just getting my bat angle right, and good, away we go. Again, technically not a lot of difference between this stroke and my long pimple version of the stroke. I'm just searching for the correct bat angle, and once I find the correct bat angle I can start to pick up the pace of my stroke a little bit. And this is a good example of why it's not a great idea to constantly be changing your rubber in the search for the perfect anti-spin, perfect long pimples, or really in any perfect rubber. The constant changing between rubbers forces you to adjust, and when you're under pressure and put under pressure, you tend to struggle to instinctively react to the correct bat angle. So I would tend to recommend finding just a good decent rubber that you're satisfied with and practice a lot more with it than trying to find a perfect rubber, of which I doubt there is one that exists. Really, you're better off finding something that's good enough and practicing a lot than spending 6 months trying to find the very perfect rubber. Okay, so getting back to the actual technique side of things again, just reiterating the basics. Stance could be a little bit wider. I wouldn't mind if I was a bit wider, then I wouldn't have to bend down to get to the ball here. I would actually be down, though it was late at night and I was getting a little bit tired by this stage. That's my excuse anyway. Free arm doing its job, just keeping me balanced. Little shoulder turn, just a little bit of coming forward with the right shoulder to allow me to swing freely with my elbow. Again, a very compact stroke without being jerky, just doesn't need to be big. Open, fairly vertical bat, going forward and a little bit upwards to really use the existing backspin to produce topspin. And as you can see from this angle, you can generate quite a reasonable amount of speed provided there's enough backspin put on the ball, and just allows you to generate without having to take too much risks. If I wish to hit lower and harder, I would be taking a more aggressive approach that would be riskier, and especially with something like the anti-spin here where I'm not totally familiar with the rubber, the feel of the rubber, I would tend to play conservatively to start with until I feel that I've adjusted and feel very comfortable. Whereas with my long pips I can play more aggressively because I know how the rubber is going to react. Okay, let's move now just to a slow motion version, and again evident here that when really things go wrong and I'm hitting into the net, it's really more a case of looking for that correct bat angle than making a radically different stroke. And ideally that's the situation you should be finding yourself in, is that if your stroke mechanic is consistent, it's repeatable, then when things go wrong it's a much faster process for you to correct, because you're not having to worry about, is my swing right, how much wrist am I using, how fast am I swinging, am I doing something different every time. All you really have to do is say, well, okay, the ball went too low, I need to open up my bat face a little bit, and you'll find you'll correct a lot faster. And that's just really a process of grooving the stroke by lots of repetition, but still while concentrating. It's important to have focus while you're practicing, so that even though you're going through the stroke again and again and again, you're switched on, you're paying attention to what you're doing, so that when it comes to a match you don't have to pay so much attention and it becomes more natural. And that grooving process is what allows me to take an unfamiliar rubber that I haven't used for a while and quite soon adjust my bat and my swing. Let's move on now to the forehand version with the Yasaka anti-power. Antispin. Again, just keeping a very similar technique to the long pips with Antispin. Nothing really radically different. And for me, again, it's just a matter of searching for that correct bat angle to start with, and saying, well, yes, I'll make a few mistakes at first, and once the correct bat angle is found, maintaining it for several strokes to try and get the feel into your muscles of this is the right angle, and then after that things become a lot easier. And as you can see, around about now I'm starting to get the feel, and my results and consistency in general start to pick up. You'll still see the odd ball go a little bit higher and the occasional ball hit the net, simply because I'm not 100% comfortable with the rubber itself. In the meantime, what I'm doing is giving it a little bit more height over the net than I would have to usually with long pips, just for safety's sake. And in a match situation, I would hopefully have done enough training with the rubber to not have to play for total safety with it. I could be a little bit more aggressive. And again, a little bit of shoulder turn, not a lot of backswing required. Certainly not a counter hit stroke, as you can tell. It doesn't look like a counter hit. It really is just that blade back, just to push back a little bit, and instead of chopping under the ball, you're really scooping upwards with the open face. Almost to a certain extent, to those of you who remember, it's almost a little bit like the old hard bat top spins in miniature, so a smaller version of that, which is not surprising considering that with hard bat you don't have a lot of spin generation, and with this particular version of the Antispin there's not a lot of spin generation either. And really just seeing a little bit of shoulder turn. Legs could definitely be wider here, the stance could be wider, the actual movement is not too bad, so I'm getting back into position. A little bit of forward lean is good. Really the legs could just be a little bit further apart. However, by this stage of the night, as my legs were getting tired, it gets a little bit harder to maintain that wide leg stance. And now just moving again to a slow motion version of the stroke, and relaxed, blade open a little bit. And because this particular Antispin does have a little bit more grip than some other Antispins on the market, you'll find, or as I'm finding here, is that occasionally the ball just grips a little bit, like in these last couple of strokes, and does clip the net, whereas a Antispin with less friction and more spin reversal would actually allow me to use a slightly more vertical bat face. But again, it's really just a matter of making some small adjustments and you're back in business, and demonstrating that here. Again, you can see as the ball heads over the net, perhaps not in that particular instance, there we go, you can see the dip being created, really not from my stroke but from the existing backspin being turned into the topspin. And I'm paying good attention to the ball, keeping well balanced, recovering back so that I'm not left stuck on my right foot. Nothing worse than leaning over to your right and then not being able to recover back. And really I'm just working on here, getting enough clearance over the net, moving the ball around in my training so that I'm not just unthinkingly going cross court every time, but I'm going to the corners, going to where I'd imagine my opponent's playing elbow is, and that allows me to not only liven up the training a little bit, but stops me from getting into poor habits of placement where you automatically place the ball without thinking. And concluding now with the front view of this stroke, and it's a little bit more evident from this view, what I was talking about before, where I am constantly moving the ball around. Again, as I said, it helps to avoid boredom. It keeps you thinking in terms of your decision making, where you are actually consciously saying, well, I'm going to put the ball to this corner, to that corner, to where I imagine his playing elbow would be. And learning to make those decisions during your play is a good thing, because then what you'll find is when it comes to an actual match, rather than relying blindly on instinct, you will be able to decide as you play, he looks vulnerable in this corner, he looks vulnerable over there, or I'll go to his elbow. And that sort of decision making is important for any of us people who use long pips and anti-spin. It's just one of the decisions we have to make along the way. We usually have, depending on the type of player you are, you'll have to decide, do I twiddle, which side do I want to use, based on which side I'm using, which stroke should I play, where should I be putting it, and then based on the stroke that I'm playing, where do I go next? Where should I be recovering to, based on my opponent's likely option? And as combination bat players, we have a lot more of these decisions than the average inverted rubber user who loops off both sides, and that's a little bit more mental hard work for us. On the other hand, the thing that's good is if we can impose our game on our opponent and take control of the match, then we can force him to have to make lots and lots of these decisions, which he is hopefully unfamiliar with. He has to read spin, he has to read your placement, check the rubber, know what stroke he's played, know what stroke you've played, and all of these things that for the typical attacking player he doesn't normally have to think very much about. These all combine, they make attacking players hesitant, they force them to play a bit safer, and they bring about mental fatigue. It affects their concentration because they're not used to having to work so hard. And it's not uncommon for sometimes you'll see a defender or a combination bat player lose, say, the first 2 games of a match, but come back from there and win the next 3, take the match, simply because his opponent has mentally checked out and can't maintain his mental sharpness, and the anti-spin player, the long pip player, gets on top of the match and grinds it out, forces his opponent to make a lot of decisions that his opponent really isn't used to, and the opponent continues to get frustrated. And this is where, from our point of view as anti-spin long pip players, as combination bat players, the longer the match goes, typically the better our chances are, and our goal is to try and avoid being overpowered quickly by an opponent. Our goal is to extend the match, make them think a lot, and the longer it goes, usually the better our chances will be. Of course, that doesn't mean that if you can't beat your opponent quickly and easily 3 straight, go ahead and do that. But you know, even if I'm down 2-0 or 3-0, I know that the longer it goes, the better my chances are, because I'm forcing my opponent to think more than he's used to make more decisions than he's used to, and I can maintain that pace and that level of decision making game after game after game after game. Whereas for most of my opponents, they usually start to get mentally tired, if not physically tired, after 2 or 3 games of having to constantly make decisions that they're not used to. And that's something that's very comforting from our point of view, to know that the longer things go, the better off you are. So part of our key then is to try and avoid being blown away very, very fast in a match.